Chapter 11. The Endless Hallway. Amber and Ruby walked down a dark hallway, the walls of which weren't made of stone or wood, but of something living. They could feel the walls pulsing like giant lungs, inhaling their fear and exhaling darkness. "We've been walking too long," Ruby said quietly, squeezing Amber's hand. "This hallway shouldn't be this long." Amber looked back. They'd only been walking for a few minutes, but the entrance to the hallway was gone, only emptiness behind them. "It's a trap," she whispered. Ruby stopped. "What if we're here forever?" Amber gritted her teeth. "No, we'll get out." She looked ahead. A light flickered at the end of the hallway. Faint, flickering, as if someone was holding a candle in the distance. "See? That's where we're going." But the further they walked, the more the hallway changed. First, the walls began to whisper. They heard voices, not just sounds, but words. "Why did you leave me?" Amber stopped, her heart pounding. She knew that voice. "No," she whispered. Ruby looked at her. "You hear it too?" Amber nodded. The voice belonged to their mother. But that was impossible. Their mother was dead. It's just an illusion. It's not real. Amber tried to push away the trembling, but her fingers clenched involuntarily. The voices grew louder. "You could have saved me, Amber." "No, it wasn't me. It wasn't my fault." Amber covered her ears, but the voice was inside her. Ruby stepped closer, took her by the shoulders. "It's not her. It's the shadow. It's playing with us." Amber grabbed Ruby's hand, as if it were her only salvation. "You kissed her." Amber froze. "What?" "You knew it was wrong, but you did it anyway." Ruby froze, too. "It's talking to you." Amber was breathing heavily. "Yes, it knows." Ruby pressed her palm to her cheek, forcing her to look into her eyes. It doesn't matter. We're together. It just wants to break you." Amber nodded, inhaling sharply. But the shadow didn't retreat. The hallway began to shrink, the walls moving as if living hands were trying to grab them. They had to move. "Now, run!" Ruby shouted, and they ran. The darkness screamed after them, but they did not stop. Only forward, only together. But when they reached the end of the corridor, there stood a figure, black with empty white eyes, and it was waiting for them. Chapter 12. The Thing from the Void. The figure stood still. Its body was covered in something dark, thick as tar. Its eyes were empty, white pupilless, like two pale spots in the endless night. Amber and Ruby stopped, out of breath from running. The hallway behind them had vanished, as if it had never existed. They were trapped now. "Who are you?" Amber's voice broke. She didn't want to show fear, but the figure was wrong. Its body wasn't just moving, it was changing, as if the darkness inside it was trying to get out. The creature took a step forward. "You call me a shadow, but I am more than a shadow." Its voice wasn't human. It was too deep, too quiet, and each word seemed to bounce off the inside of the skull. "You brought me here yourself." Amber felt her hands go cold. "What are you talking about?" "You opened the door. You invited me in. You let me in, and now I'm part of you." Ruby squeezed Amber's hand. "That's a lie." The creature slowly tilted its head. "Really?" In that moment, everything changed. The darkness exploded around them, and they were no longer in this place, but in the past. Amber recognized that moment immediately. They were back in the house. The very night it all started. But something was different. Ruby felt it, too. This isn't a memory. This is something else. The creature wasn't in front of them anymore. It was everywhere now. "Look at what you've done." A corpse appeared before Amber. A woman, arms outstretched, eyes open. Their mother. "No." Amber took a step back. "You could have saved her." Ruby grabbed Amber's shoulders sharply. "Don't listen to him. It's not true." But the voice didn't stop. "You chose her instead." The second corpse. Ruby, her own body lifeless, cold. Amber covered her ears. "Enough. It's not true." The creature laughed. But the choice must be made again. The shadows swirled, enveloping them, and everything disappeared. They were in the void again, but now they were separated. Amber and Ruby were in different worlds, and the darkness was ready to engulf them. Chapter 13, Separated Worlds. Amber blinked. The darkness was no longer around her. She stood on a snowy street, a narrow alley, old streetlights flickering yellow. She knew this place. This was their hometown. But something was wrong. He was dead. No cars. No people. No sounds. Just white snow and a silence so deep it was as if she could hear herself think out loud. Ruby? Amber's voice echoed through the empty streets. No one answered. She took a few steps forward, leaving footprints in the snow. But when she looked back, there were no footprints. Her heart sank. This isn't reality. This is a trap. But if this wasn't her world, then where was Ruby? Ruby was suffocating. She woke up in an old house. Their house. The smell of dust and burning hit her nose. Smoke, fire crawled up the walls, and a familiar voice called to her from another room. Ruby, help me. She knew that voice. She couldn't forget it. Mom. But it wasn't right. Mom was dead. Ruby took a step forward. The floorboards creaked. Ruby, you left me? Her heart pounded. She didn't. She couldn't. That wasn't true. But the voice was getting louder, and a shadowy figure appeared from around the corner. You always chose her over me. Ruby froze. It wasn't Mom. It was Amber. Her face was hidden in shadow, but her eyes were lifeless. Ruby took a step back. Is that you? The figure slowly tilted its head. You betrayed me. And the darkness began to move. Amber and Ruby found themselves in their fears. But they were alone, and the darkness was about to swallow them. Chapter 14, When the Dark Speaks. Amber knew this wasn't her world, but it felt real. She walked through the empty streets, the cold chilling her to the bone. No wind, no sounds, just an endless, dead silence. But then something changed. One of the street lights ahead flickered and turned red. Amber froze. It was impossible. But then a second light flickered, and a third, and with each new flickering light, the city changed. The houses were crumbling, the streets were cracking, and the snow was slowly turning to ash. The city was dying. But the worst thing was what appeared ahead. A silhouette, tall, long, black as night. But it wasn't standing. It was getting closer. Ruby gasped. Flames rose up the walls, heat searing her skin. But it wasn't fire. It was darkness, burning like a living thing. She took a step back, but the door behind her was gone. You betrayed me. The figure in front of her whispered. Amber's voice. But it wasn't Amber. Ruby knew that, but her heart still clenched in fear. You're not real. Her voice trembled, but she wouldn't back down. The figure stepped closer. She was in the light of the fire now. But her face, it wasn't there. Just an empty mask with no eyes, no mouth. But when she spoke, the voice came from inside Ruby's head. You forgot me, but I'll never forget you. And in that moment, the world split. Amber ran. The figure behind her didn't move. But the further she ran, the closer he became, as if space itself was pushing her into his arms. You won't run away. The voice came from all directions at once. She screamed and woke up. Ruby stood in the middle of nowhere. The flames were gone. The house was gone. Only darkness. And footsteps. They were walking toward her. Not Amber. Something else. But before she could see what it was, the world exploded with light. And she woke up, too. They woke up in the same place. Together again. But something had changed. Now they knew what this world wanted from them. And they had to make a decision. But there was little time left for that. Chapter 15. He's coming. Amber sucked in a sharp breath. It felt like she'd been pulled out of a black hole, and her heart was still there in the darkness. She glanced back. Ruby was sitting next to her, out of breath, her hands shaking. You saw that too? She whispered. Amber nodded. They were together. But that didn't mean it was over. The room they'd woken up in wasn't real. Bare gray walls. The floor was covered in black symbols that moved like snakes. And silence. Not just the absence of sound. The absence of everything. This place. Amber clenched her fists. It's alive. Ruby looked at the door ahead, and it's waiting for something. They stood up. Their bodies still felt the echoes of sleep, heat, cold, fear. But they couldn't stop. Amber carefully touched the door. It swung open on its own, and beyond it was darkness. But this time the darkness was moving. It floated like thick black smoke, swirling into a silhouette. Him, tall, faceless, voiceless. But he was there. Ruby felt her fingers go cold. What do we do? Amber looked at her and heard the answer. You've already chosen. The darkness rushed forward, and everything exploded. They couldn't scream, because they didn't exist. For a moment, they weren't. But then, they were again, and the world changed. They stood in Elmwood, but this wasn't the Elmwood they knew. It was older, darker, livelier, and something was waiting for them in this town, because he had come with them. And now the game was just beginning, because he was already approaching. Ruby didn't think. She simply stepped forward and kissed Amber. The lips were as cold as the air around them. But with the touch came warmth. Amber froze for a moment. The entire world was gone. There was no Elmwood, no shadow, no fear, just them. Ruby pressed closer, her fingers shaking, but she didn't pull away. Amber felt something inside her break. The barrier, the fear. She kissed him back. And in that moment, the darkness howled. The world shook. They were not allowed to be together. It was here, and it was angry. Chapter 16, The Wrath of Darkness. The air vibrated. The kiss was brief, but real. But this world did not tolerate such things. It hated the light. The shadow howled. Ruby jerked back, her breath hitching. Amber grabbed her hand, squeezing tightly, as if she were afraid to lose it again. Run. They rushed forward. But where? Elmwood was not the same. Shadows crawled along the walls. Cracks spread across the ground. The houses moved, as if something was breathing inside them, and he was behind them. A huge, blurry shape swallowed the streets, following them silently. But they felt him. Every step became heavier, as if the world wanted to leave them here. We can't escape. Ruby gasped, but she didn't stop. We already escaped. Amber stopped abruptly. Ruby crashed into her, but Amber didn't stagger. She stared into the darkness, clenching her fists. You can't break us. The shadow stopped. She hadn't expected this. This world lived on fear, but the fear was starting to fade. Amber unclenched her fingers. She took Ruby's hand. We're not choosing you. Ruby squeezed her fingers back, and the darkness exploded. They woke up. The real Elmwood. Night. Rain fell on empty streets. They were free. Ruby turned to Amber, her eyes still trembling with fear. But there was something else in them. Was that real? Amber looked at her. Then she kissed her back softly. I don't know, but we got out. And while the city slept, they knew one thing. He's not gone. He's just waiting. Chapter 17. It's still here. The rain pounded the pavement. The city was quiet, but something had changed. Ruby squeezed Amber's hand as they walked down the empty street. It was real. Ruby's voice was quiet, but confident. Amber looked at her. Yes, they got out, but IT didn't leave. IT was watching. Every shadow, every dark corner. It seemed like IT was everywhere now. We have to find out what it is. Amber paused, looking at Ruby. Ruby nodded. And how do we do that? Amber pulled an old key from her pocket. The same key they'd found in the house. The same key that didn't belong to any door. Until today. Ruby shuddered. Do you want to go back? Amber looked at the shadows around them. They were waiting. We have no choice. She took a step forward, and the world began to change again. Chapter 18. The door that shouldn't exist. Amber slowly ran her fingers over the old key. It was cold, like it had just been pulled from the dead earth. Ruby swallowed. Are you sure? Amber looked ahead. The door. It had appeared where it hadn't been a second ago, in the middle of an empty alley, right in the wall between two shops. It looked old, like it was 100 years old. The worn wood, the black metal handle, the scratch symbols Ruby couldn't understand, but she could feel them. They were whispering to her. Don't go in. You shouldn't. IT already knows you're here. Ruby took a step back. Amber, what if there's no way out? Amber ran her finger over the key. Chapter 19, Stairway to Nowhere. Step, step, step. Ruby could feel the air around them thickening, as if it were saturated with something invisible but alive. The stairs went down forever, and the walls changed with each passing minute. First concrete, then brick, now black stone, wet as if blood had washed over it. We've been going down too long. Ruby's voice shook. Amber didn't stop. That's what they want us to think. Ruby gritted her teeth. She could feel them, watching eyes in the dark. Something was moving behind them. Step, 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 and then silence. The stairs ended. There was a new door ahead of them, but this one wasn't like the first. It was breathing. Its surface moved, as if there was something alive inside. Ruby touched it with her fingers, and the door trembled like skin. Ruby screamed and pulled her hand away. Amber looked at her. We have to go in. Ruby shook her head. What if we don't get out? Amber squeezed her hand. Then we'll find each other. And she opened the door. There was no floor behind the door. There was only darkness. And it swallowed them. Chapter 20, Falling into the Void. They were flying, but not like in a dream, not in free fall. They were sinking into something viscous, like the air had turned liquid, like thick oil enveloping their bodies, pulling them down. Ruby couldn't scream. Her mouth was filled with darkness. Ember reached for her, but her fingers crumbled into black dust. And then Ruby knew they were separating them. No, but her voice was lost in the abyss. Ember was disappearing. Ruby struggled, tore herself away from the sticky darkness, but her strength was leaving her. And then it spoke. You came here. You belong to us now. It wasn't a voice. It was an echo in her mind. Ruby closed her eyes. No. Ember fell to the hard surface. Her hands were raw and bloody. Her lips were split. The darkness was gone, but she was alone. Ruby? Silence. And then laughter. Muffled, old, frozen in this place. Not her. Not Ruby. Someone else. Something else. Ember looked up. There was something ahead, hidden in the shadows. And it knew her name. Chapter 21. It's been waiting for them for a long time. Amber slowly rose to her feet. Every movement was painful, but she kept her eyes on the figure ahead. The shadows swayed as if alive, hiding the outlines of something enormous. But when it spoke, the voice was calm. You came. Amber clenched her fists. Where's Ruby? The figure didn't move, but the darkness around her whispered. She's already with us. You came too late. She agreed. Amber felt something inside her snap. No, Ruby couldn't. You're lying. The darkness laughed. And then Ruby came out. But it wasn't her. The eyes were too black. The smile was too sharp. Ruby took a step forward, her voice empty. Amber, I'm home. Amber flinched. No. Ruby moved closer, her fingers as cold as dead ice touching Amber's cheek. Why fight? Just stay. Amber felt herself being pulled into this lie. But then she remembered. Warm hands. The real Ruby. The one who wouldn't give in. Amber grabbed Ruby's wrist roughly. I won't let you go. And the world began to crumble. Chapter 22. I found you. The world cracked. The darkness roared as Amber yanked Ruby from her grasp. The real Ruby. She was cold, her body shaking, but her eyes, the eyes were hers again. Amber? Her voice was weak, broken. Amber held her tighter. I'm here. Ruby whimpered, her fingers clutching Amber's clothes. The darkness didn't want to let go, but now they were holding on to each other. They wouldn't let go. The shadows screamed, the walls crumbled, but Amber wasn't afraid anymore. She closed her eyes and kissed Ruby. Warm lips, alive, real. When they pulled away, the world changed. The darkness broke. The ground fell away into nothingness, and they were back in Elmwood, the present, under the stars, under the streetlights. Amber held her. Ruby looked at her. Her breath hitched. You... Amber ran her fingers down her cheek, smiling through her tears. I fell in love with you. Ruby froze. Then she smiled. You took so long to say that. I thought I'd have to say it first. Amber laughed softly. They kissed again. And in the distance, in the shadows of the city at night, someone was watching. This isn't over yet. Chapter 23. It didn't go Amber could feel Ruby's warmth, her breath, her heart beating as fast as her own. But even in this moment, even under the streetlights, something was wrong. IT was watching. IT didn't go away. Ruby pulled away slowly, her fingers still shaking, but her eyes were bright. We're out. Amber looked at her, and then out into the street. Elmwood looked the same as always, but in the distance, around the corner where the streetlights couldn't reach, she saw a shadow, tall, irregular, like the silhouette of someone who didn't know how to stand up straight. Amber clenched her jaw. Ruby saw it, too. What now? Amber took her hand again. We're not running away. The darkness trembled. The silhouette moved, and then it stepped into the light. Amber inhaled sharply. It wasn't a person. It was something like them, but too familiar. Ruby froze. That's impossible. Amber couldn't speak, because they were standing before them. They're copies, only without eyes, and without smiles. Chapter 24. Mirrors that don't reflect. Amber couldn't breathe. Ruby couldn't move. Their counterparts were staring right back at them, but without eyes. Just empty, dark pits with things moving in them. The silence became tangible, as if the world was holding its breath along with them. And then they spoke, but not with their mouths. The voices were right in their heads. You stole her from us. You brought her back. Amber felt the cold creep into her bones. She gasped for air, but it felt heavy as water. Ruby staggered, clutching her head in her hands. Stop it. But the voices didn't stop. You both came where you shouldn't have. And you're both ours now. Amber looked up. No, they won't let you. She squeezed Ruby's hand. It's not true. The copies froze. For a second, the silence was absolute, and then their faces began to change. Ruby screamed, because their doubles now looked just like them, with eyes, with smiles, and they stepped forward. We are you, and you are us. You won't leave. Their voices sounded just like the real ones, and Amber realized something terrible. One of them was out of place, and if they made a mistake, they might pick the wrong one. Chapter 25. Which one of us is real? Amber froze. 2 rubies. 2 ambers. But one pair is false. Ruby stared at herself, her eyes trembling with fear. The doppelgangers smiled. We are the same. Their voices were too calm. Amber felt that if they believed, if they allowed the slightest doubt, that's it. Ruby staggered back. You're not me. The doppelganger bowed his head, his eyes gleaming with darkness. I remember how afraid you were of the dark when you were a child. The real Ruby flinched. I remember how you cried when your mother broke your favorite mug. Ruby clenched her fists. No. She shouldn't listen. But their voices, too similar, too real. Amber felt the fear in her eyes. If Ruby hesitated, they would lose. Amber's double stepped forward. And you? His voice sounded exactly like hers. How can I know the truth? How can I not be mistaken? The darkness around them was moving. And then Amber understood. The real Ruby always trembled when she was afraid. And the one standing before her now was too calm. Amber pulled the knife from her pocket and stabbed the double with a sharp blow. Ruby screamed. But not that one. The false one. The shadow arched, its body opening like torn fabric. An inhuman scream erupted from its mouth. And then it was gone. The real Ruby remained standing. She sobbed, grabbed Amber's hand. I'm here. Amber exhaled. I know. But their victory was short-lived. Amber's double still stood before them. He didn't attack. He smiled. You were wrong. And then the world went dark. Chapter 26, Mistake. The darkness slammed shut, like the mouth of a monster that had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Amber couldn't breathe. Ruby squeezed her hand too tightly, as if she was afraid it would be taken away again. But the darkness had already taken over. Amber's doppelganger's voice echoed, cold, emotionless. You were wrong. She realized it. Too late. The Ruby she had saved wasn't the same. Amber turned, her heart pounding in her chest like a trapped bird. Ruby was watching her too closely, too vividly, and then she smiled. Amber staggered back. No, no. Ruby stepped closer, her fingers brushing Amber's cheek, softly, but not like before. You chose me, Amber. She felt her blood run cold. Ruby! Her sister bowed her head slowly, her eyes reflecting the darkness too deeply. You love me, don't you? Amber didn't answer, because it wasn't her. The real Ruby was somewhere in the darkness. They hadn't saved her. They had given her away. And now it stood before Amber, reaching out a hand, waiting for her to accept her mistake. Chapter 27. It's not Ruby anymore. Amber didn't breathe. Ruby stood before her. But it wasn't her. Something too right about her smile. Skin too smooth, as if it had been recreated. All imperfections removed. But the scariest thing was her eyes. Black deep down, like mirrors that don't reflect. Amber stepped back. Ruby took a step forward. Why are you afraid? Her voice was the same as always. But now Amber heard the lie. You're not her. The words came out hoarsely. Ruby didn't blink. I remember everything. She slowly reached for Amber's face, her fingers shaking slightly. Too perfect. Too artificial. I remember you holding my hand when I was afraid of thunderstorms. I remember you crying after our first kiss. I remember telling you loved me. Amber gritted her teeth. No, that wasn't Ruby. The real Ruby was out there somewhere, in the shadows, imprisoned. And that was the thief. The darkness that had taken her form. Ruby slowly bowed her head. I sense that you doubted. Her voice became quieter, more gentle. But if you love me, why does it matter? Amber felt something break inside, because the voice was real. Almost, because she wished it were true. But this isn't her Ruby. Amber raised her hand. A knife was in her fingers. Dark Ruby blinked. You won't do this. You can't. Amber sobbed. She was right. But then behind her there was a whisper. Weak. Real. Amber. She turned sharply. In the shadows, almost invisible on her knees, the real Ruby, wounded, trembling. Her lips barely moved. This isn't me. And then the false Ruby grabbed Amber by the throat. Chapter 28. The Choice. Fingers closed around her throat. False Ruby hissed, her smile gone, eyes blazed with darkness. Don't look at her. Amber flinched, but her grip was steel. Dark nails dug into her skin, catching her breath. But the real Ruby, she was there. Weak. True. Her lips moved again. Amber. Her voice was faint, but alive. False Ruby leaned closer, her breath hot against Amber's ear. Don't listen to her. The voice was the same as always, but Amber knew now. She could feel it. This wasn't hers. The real Ruby was in the darkness, still alive, still fighting. But if she was wrong, if she chose the wrong one, Ruby would die. Forever. Make a choice. Echoes echoed through her mind. False Ruby squeezed her throat tighter. Real Ruby whispered her name. The darkness waited. Waited for an answer. Who would she choose? Who would she save? Chapter 29. Save me or stay with me. Time stood still. Two Rubies. One living, one false. But who to save? The fingers on her throat tightened. Look at me, Amber. The false Ruby's voice was shaking, but gentle. You don't want to lose me, do you? The real Ruby let out a hoarse breath. It's not me. Her voice was weak. She was barely holding on. The false Ruby chuckled. Then make a choice. A choice. Who to keep. Amber was shaking. Her heart was beating so hard it felt like it would burst. She looked into familiar eyes, the one she loved. But her Ruby wasn't there, only darkness. The false Ruby whispered softly, "If you choose her, I'll disappear." Amber sobbed, "You never existed." The words cut her heart, but it was true. The false Ruby blinked. Then she smiled. "Are you sure?" The voice merged with the echo. The shadows trembled. Amber exhaled. "Yes." She jerked away, clutching the knife. The darkness screamed. But she had already made her choice. She had chosen her Ruby. Chapter 30. Home. Amber had no doubt. She snatched Ruby from the darkness, hugged her. Fake Ruby screamed. Her body was breaking like a broken mirror. But Amber wasn't looking. She was holding her Ruby. Warm. Real. "Forgive me," she whispered. Ruby was shaking in her arms. But her heart was beating. Alive. Lovely. Amber kissed her hard, like it was the last time. But it wasn't over. They survived. She hugged Ruby even tighter. "Let's go home." Ruby closed her eyes. "Yes." And the darkness retreated.